When you play the Game of Thrones, you
subscribe and like.
or you die. There is no middle ground.
All right, hello YouTube. Welcome back to the Grease Comedy YouTube channel. Today's video, we're going to be kind of continuing our Dance of Dragons retrospective, but in its own kind of standalone video as well. I want to rank every single POV within a Dance of Dragons. There are a lot of them, and I want to kind of give my thoughts on the book as well, just in a POV ranking within a Dance of Dragons. So I do have some things that I use to rank these POVs. Now, the first thing is consistency, just based upon chapter to chapter, how good is your POV overall, right? Do you have some really good chapters, some really bad chapters, some mid chapters? On average, when I go to your chapter, right? So say Daenerys, for instance, what should I be expecting, right? Based upon this book. Or am I expecting a pretty mid chapter? Or am I expecting a pretty good chapter? Whatever. Another thing is, how entertaining are they as a POV? Like, how entertaining is it to be in their head as a character? For instance, one of my favorites from A Feast for Crows was Jaime. It's really awesome to be in his head because he has some really interesting moral dilemmas that he's trying to work towards in that book. And so that's a big part of it as well. There is some that's just, okay, I have favorite characters, so that might influence how I look at them as a POV. I think how much a character forwards the plot is very important as well. And how do they mix that with character development and world building as well? Something that George really struggles with, I think, in the last two books of the series, is how does he expand the world while also forwarding the plot and forwarding the POV character that we have and the characters around them? I think that's something he struggled a lot more with in the last two books than he did with the first three. I think the reason is because in the first, I think especially the first book, the chapters were much smaller. And so you had to be very direct with how you're telling the story. You had to, maybe cut out some of the world building because a lot of it was for character development and moving the plot forward. Dance of Dragons doesn't do that nearly as well, in my opinion. So let's get into the list. So number 18, I think this is nobody's surprise, is Quentyn. I did not enjoy reading Quentyn in this book. I think, of all the POVs in each of the books, there are very few ones that I say I just genuinely do not like and hate. Quentyn is one of those. Quentyn serves no purpose, in my opinion, to the story outside of his last chapter. I think if you erase Quentyn completely and have him just sprout up when he does within Daenerys' POV, and then just have Quentyn maybe give the quick summary of what, happened basically off the book page that we didn't see, would have worked just as well, in my opinion. And so I get why Quentyn's here, because somebody has to release the dragons and you want this impactful death at the end of the book. Personally, I didn't enjoy the character of Quentyn. I think he had way too many convenient contrivances, it almost felt like. His whole journey with the windblown just felt kind of odd to me. It felt like, oh, that's convenient. We have no way of getting to Daenerys, and instantly we find the sellsword company. And, that in and of itself is fine, but it's when you have a lot of those things where it's, oh, okay, Quentyn needs to get to Meereen to speak to Daenerys. Oh, well, the Windblown are now going to have a mission where they specifically give Quentyn and a number of others to flip to go to Daenerys' side. It's just a lot of conveniences that, if they're isolated, they can make sense. But when you have so many of them happening just in Quentyn's plotline, it just doesn't feel that great. It doesn't feel like a normal story. And Quentyn himself is a character that I don't really enjoy that much. He doesn't have all that much of a personality or a character. So by the time he dies, I don't really care all that much about him. I'm kind of glad he's out of the story. So Quentyn, I know he has 4 chapters, which is more than a lot of the characters on this list, or at least equal to a good amount of them. But I just didn't enjoy reading him. Number 17, I think, is a big surprise, just based on how I ranked, characters. I think for me, I personally value a character having a lot of POV chapters, because that means we're getting a lot of substance from the story through this character, right? They're a major focal point of the story. And unfortunately for Dance of Dragons, Tyrion, who has the second most amount of chapters in this book at 12, he is just not very good in this book at all. He never really hits the heights of a lot of the other major POVs. His best chapter, in my opinion, comes when he's with young Griff and the reveal of Aegon. And outside of that, like after he leaves young Griff and he goes, you get into more like Tyrion 6, 7, and forwards, his plotline is just, I dreaded reading his plotline. A part of why I think I paused when I did with this series is a lot of because you get a lot of Tyrion and a lot of Quentyn, and they're just not very good at the beginning of the book. Well, Tyrion I think is good until he gets to about Tyrion 5 or not Tyrion 5, Tyrion 6 and then Tyrion 7. It's just a lot of things where Tyrion in this book should have been cut down. He feels like a character that is he's just traveling. I mean, a lot of chapters he's just traveling. There isn't a whole lot of characters around Tyrion that he can use his wit. And so I think this is one of the biggest falls from grace because Tyrion was so interesting in the last two books in Storm of Swords and Clash of Kings that he was in. And this book, he just didn't really have many people around him make his POVs all that interesting. Penny is a character that is kind of like Sansa in a way, where she's very innocent to the world and things like that. And it doesn't really play off with Tyrion all that well, in my opinion. And then you also have him with Jorah, and Jorah is just kind of this brute that isn't all that interesting. And so, especially the second half of his arc, he just doesn't have a good supporting cast around him. And it really shows and hurts him as a character. And you start to see the old version of Tyrion where he actually has some characters around him to play off of with Brown, Ben, Plum, especially like in the last two chapters he has. But, that period, Tyrion 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 is a tough part of the book. It's just a tough part of the book. And Tyrion, to me, he has some good chapters, but they're very few and far between at times. And so I put a lot of, characters that have only one or two chapters above him because at least their chapters that they show up in are usually pretty good. So, yeah, I'm not a big fan of Tyrion in this book. I think he needed to be cut down to maybe 7 to 8 chapters, and that would have helped us get to more important things in this book, like the Battle of Ice and Fire, which, in my opinion, would have also then helped Tyrion as a character because he also has, in my opinion, the weakest conclusion of all the main characters, as his conclusion is just, we're going to convince the Second Sons to flip to Daenerys' side. It's like, hey, that kind of seems obvious, right? Like, he just has a very weak conclusion because we don't get to see the Battle of Fire. Number 16. So number 16 is Varamyr. I've kind of said this in the past. Of all the prologues, Varamyr is my least favorite. And I don't think, the prologue's bad to this book by any means. But to me, all the things I enjoy about the world of A Song of Ice and Fire are more of the nitty gritty, the more politicky, real life type stuff, the dark fantasy elements of the story, the anti-war themes. I've been someone that always has never been a huge fan of like magic in fantasy. You think about, for instance, Lord of the Rings, or you think about the Dragon Age series, video game series, by the way, or D&D. I'm never somebody that like leans towards the magical. I like more of the realistic sense. And so this chapter just, I don't think is for me, because it's very linked to only really two plot lines. It's really linked heavily to Bran's plot line and then somewhat to Jon's plot line because it's the fallout of the Battle of the Wall. And you also have that warging ability that's probably going to come into effect with Jon going into Ghost and living through Ghost for a while. And so the chapter does have implications and teaches us a bit more about how warging works and things like that. But I don't find this chapter to be as entertaining as others, especially ones that have only one chapter, like Kevan, Mel, Jaime, those other counterparts. So Varamyr, again, I think it just isn't for me personally. I know a lot of people really like Varamyr. For the first chapter of this book, I'm not the biggest fan. Number 15, I have Areo Hotah. Now, Areo Hotah, it's so weird because the content and the things that happen in his chapters are usually really good and really paced really well. It's just the fact that Areo Hotah is not an entertaining POV. I don't like being in Areo Hotah's head. I think he is carried by the fact that he always gets to be the POV look into with, Duran or Arianne. I find it kind of baffling, in my opinion, that we didn't get this POV that Hotah gets as Arianne, because if Arianne had been the POV for this chapter specifically that Hotah has, where it's kind of them laying out the foundations and work of what they're going to do in Winds of Winter, Arianne going to check out this young Griff character, the Sand Snakes going to King's Landing and also to find Darkstar. If all of that had happened through Arianne's, eyes and her head, I think I'd have Arianne much higher than this. But Areo Hotah really gets held down because he just isn't that interesting of a POV, unfortunately, even though I do like the chapter that he has. Number 14, I have Melisandre. So Melisandre is probably the biggest surprise, I would say, of this book in terms of POVs we got in it. And I really do like her POV chapter because we get to see more about her as a character, right? How much power does she truly have? Has she been tricking people? What does she up to, right? And so seeing all that through, her eyes, her trying to figure out what messages R'hllor is sending her and trying to figure out what that means and what she should tell people like Jon and others about what she's seeing is very fascinating because it kind of brings up these questions like, if Lightbringer, isn't actually Lightbringer, like if Stannis' sword isn't actually Lightbringer, why does Mel believe in him? Because Mel does believe that Stannis is Azor Ahai. Why does she believe those things? And so it adds up a bunch of interesting questions. But also, I think this chapter is here more because, A, when Jon dies, we need a POV here. And Melisandre will probably take up that mantle until Jon kind of returns. But, you also wanted to give kind of a look into Melisandre and give, her a bit more character work before we then have her be a full-blown POV in the next book. I found Melisandre to be extremely interesting. Unfortunately, we only get one chapter with her, so I did put her underneath two of the other characters that have one chapter each, and I think they are slightly better in my opinion. Well, I'd say for one of them, much better, but yeah. So that gets us to number 13. I have Jaime. Now, Jaime has one chapter in this book as well. It is completely focusing on wrapping up the Riverland conflict that Jaime has started in his Feast for Crows arc. It's him dealing with the Blackwoods and the Brackens, which is fantastic. We get a ton of our lore between the Blackwood and Bracken conflict through this chapter with Jaime. I wish we had gotten more Jaime. He is, again, the best POV of Feast for Crows, and being back into his head is fantastic in this book. The only thing that holds him down is just that he only has one chapter. I think his chapter, I don't remember exactly where I ranked it, but I do remember ranking it like within the top at least 30. Just looking at it right now, I have it ranked as the 19th best chapter of the book. So that's pretty good given there's 73 chapters in this book. And this is a very top heavy book in terms of really great chapters. So again, great chapter by Jaime, but limited because he only has one chapter. Number 12, I have Victarion. Now, Victarion is a really fun POV to read. A lot of the reason that he's higher than some of these other characters with only one POV or whatnot, he's just fun to read. You're never bored when you read a Victarion, chapter. You don't know what he's going to do. He's kind of like this wild card character because he's, this brutish type of guy, but he's also kind of dumb. And, his plot line is kind of fascinating, in my opinion, just based upon, okay, what does Euron want from Victarion? And Victarion trying to work out all those things while also not being the smartest guy in the world. He's just everybody's kind of favorite, lovable, like, barbarian sea guy, more or less is what he is. And so that's just where he is. I don't think he's, a great POV. I know other people really love Victarion as POV. I think he's a fine POV. I'm never going to be upset turning to a Victarion POV chapter, but at the same time, I'm never going to be like that excited for a Victarion POV chapter either. So number 11, this is kind of the last of the one POV chapter characters, but I do have the epilogue in Kevan Lannister. Kevan is one of my favorite characters because of this chapter, because we finally get to see inside of this character, see what he's been about this whole time. He's a character that I find, to be interesting as he's been living in his brother's shadow, very similar to like a character of Stannis with Robert, and the way he goes about trying to fix all the issues that Cersei has done. He's doing a really good job of it. And seeing how he plays the Tyrells and all that, and leading to his inevitable death and this tragic end to the story for A Dance with Dragons, it's, in my opinion, the perfect conclusion. I think of all the books, it does have a really great finish. I would probably put it up there as maybe my second favorite ending, only behind Game of Thrones with Daenerys' last chapter. So again, I love Kevan. He only held down because he has one chapter. That's it. He'd be much higher if he had maybe a couple more chapters. But given that, I put him at number 11. So reaching into our top 10, I have someone that will either make you happy or sad. We'll see. I feel like the community is very divided on how it feels about Daenerys. And to me, I think she's not great, and I don't think she's horrible in this book. I think she's just right there in the middle. So that's how I placed her. I placed her at number 10. She is a character that has one really defining great chapter in this book, like she has in every single book she's in. But outside of that, the rest of her chapters are around the middle of my rankings. I mean, I went back and I looked at it. I almost just have a cluster of Dany chapters kind of around that 30 to 40 range. And that's where most of her chapters are ranked outside of like one of them. Like, I do not have another Daenerys chapter outside of Dany 9 in my entire top 30. So that should tell you how I feel about Daenerys. But she also doesn't have a chapter that's like in the bottom 10 of the book either. So she's a character that is kind of just okay. Like, there's good things about her plot line, and there's bad things about her plot line. Let's talk about the good, for instance, why I think she's above some of the other characters in here. I think when we get stuff where it's Daenerys having to make hard decisions and looking and testing her morale, it's very interesting, right? Putting her in uncomfortable situations where, she has all these refugees from Astapor coming to Meereen. What does she do about that, right? Like, they have this plague. They can't feed them. Well, what does she do about that, right? It's a really tough decision she has to make. Or the multiple times early in the book where, she is given an option to maybe leave Meereen and go to Westeros, but she doesn't. And she has to make compromises to try and rule over the city. So I love those aspects of Daenerys' character. I love the aspects where Daenerys is being tested as a ruler and as a person. Things I don't love about Daenerys in this book is sometimes the romance stuff drags on. Her constantly thinking about Daario, or her romance when Daario was present, or all the lead up and stuff to the Hisdar wedding and some of that stuff, going forward after. Then you introduce another suitor with Quentyn, and you have young Griff who is supposed to marry her, and you have Victarion coming. Like, I just feel like I don't enjoy the romance side of Daenerys' arc because there's just so much of it. There's so many different type of characters that are trying to compete for that and do all that stuff. And I think at parts of this book, it kind of runs on too much. And I will say about Daenerys is she feels like, just throughout the whole book, she feels like a character where her chapters kind of run together. Like, even me removed, I would say a good number of months from reading her, early chapters, some of them start to blend together because there isn't like for instance, Jon, right? In his early chapters, he has very significant moments throughout each chapter that help you remember, exactly what happens in each chapter. For instance, the beginning, you have the Stannis section of the story for Jon. So you have, Jaina Slynt being killed, and you have Jon asking for the wildlings, but giving Stannis this, the mountain clans where he can go for that and all that. Daenerys doesn't really have that. Daenerys has a lot of chapters that cover the same type of topics, but just in different chapters. And so I think Daenerys has the problem of Cersei in the middle of A Feast for Crows, where Cersei has a couple chapters that kind of run together in your mind, and they're hard to differentiate. Daenerys kind of has that throughout the whole book, outside of like Daenerys 9, which is one of the best of the book. So Daenerys, in my opinion, she's just a fine POV of this book. I don't think she's great. I don't think she's, terrible either. Number 9, I have Arya. I loved Arya in this book. I didn't remember loving Arya in this book as much as I do now. I mean, I have both of her chapters within my top 30, one of them being at 8 and the other one being directly at 30. I really enjoyed her arc. I think it took everything that Feast for Crows was setting up and then paid it off in this book. And it felt earned. It felt great. It felt like this stuff should have been in Feast for Crows is what it feels like. And it's us exploring more of the Faceless Men, getting more into their magic and the ways that they go about doing things. And still Arya kind of trying to figure that out, but her also still holding on to parts of herself, right? Like, why is she killing people, right? And all that type of stuff that goes along with that. Whereas the Faceless Men, just want her to kill them because they say so. And so you have a lot of that going on in this book as well. I think the only thing that holds Arya down is she only has 2 chapters. If Arya had more chapters in this book, she'd be much higher than just number 9, for instance. If she had more chapters, because again, we still have a couple characters, and, going up the rest of these rankings, 3 through 8 all have 4 chapters or less. So I think if Arya would have had more chapters in this book, she would have gotten a little higher, but I think that's the only thing that really holds her down. Number 8, I have Bran. Now, again, very similar to Arya. Bran is a character that only has 3 POV chapters in this book They're all fantastic. I love all 3 of Bran's chapters in this book. It finally feels like we start to have a lot of tension. We're getting to the best parts of Bran in the series. And then all of a sudden, George cuts him off about halfway through this book. Now, I'm not George. I don't know what's in George's head. I don't know if George just wanted Bran to develop more off screen so that when we come back to the character, he's advanced quite a bit because we haven't seen him for a good amount of time. And he's also learning to see things and all this stuff that maybe George doesn't want us to see. So he's waiting for Winds of Winter to, continue with that character. It's similar to how he wanted like the 5-year time skip between Storm and the last 2 books. Maybe he's kind of doing that kind of a situation because it just seems very weird that Bran finally gets to, in my opinion, these 3 chapters he has in this book are some of his best of the entire series, of the entire first 3 books. And then all of a sudden, he disappears after he gets Jojen paced, more than likely, and we start seeing him seeing these visions of the past and almost being able to interact with the past, right? Calling to his father, for instance, and his father reacting to it. I think it's interesting that George decided to cut this character off at the halfway point, but I really did enjoy Bran's journey from him going with cold hands to making it to the cave, learning more knowledge and things like that. It seems heartbreaking for Bran because he believed he'd be able to at least walk again, but no, he will be able to fly, more or less, is kind of what Bloodraven tells him. I really like Bran. I think Bran, same thing of Arya. If Bran had more chapters, I think he would be a bit higher than this. But with that being said, there's a number of characters that have very similar chapter counts that Bran has that I just prefer more than Bran, unfortunately, for Bran. Number 7, I have Cersei. Now, Cersei has 2 POV chapters within this book. They both feel like they should have been in Feast for Crows, but that's kind of a Feast for Crows' fault, not Dance with Dragons' fault, because her chapters of seeing her right after she's been imprisoned, after everything that happened in Feast for Crows, being completely broken down and desperate, that she would even consider doing this Walk of Atonement, that easily is one of the most traumatic things you could possibly go through. And watching her come back down to earth and seeing her reduced to the state that she's in by the end of A Dance with Dragons is one of the best writing I think that George has done. Just in terms of making us care about Cersei in a way that we could never have believed we'd be able to do in book 1. Making the Faith more hateable and more villainous, it would appear, than someone like Cersei, where you even feel bad for Cersei. It's some of the best writing that I've seen George actually do, and I think it's very underrated in the community. But I will say, once again, why is she down here at 7? With all that praise I just gave her, she only has 2 chapters. I mean, I really enjoyed both of her chapters, just like Arya, but even better. But I think there's characters that have a bit more of a story start to finish in this book and have more chapters than her that deserve to be higher. If these 2 chapters had been in A Feast for Crows, I would have said that Cersei was the best POV of A Feast for Crows. But because she didn't have that natural conclusion, which the conclusion for Feast for Crows for sure, Cersei is still good, it's just not as good as it could have been, and these chapters kind of prove that. But here, she's still solid. She's still going to be up in the upper part of this ranking, even with only having 2 chapters. Number 6 comes in with my highest rated character with 2 chapters, and that is Jon Connington. I mean, what can you say? I love Jon Connington's chapters. I love what we get with the prelude of him with Tyrion, this character that is deeply traumatized by his past and the Battle of the Bells and being put into exile, but then now finding this newfound love for Rhaegar's son and trying to get him on the Iron Throne. We get a lot of our lore about the Golden Company through Jon Connington. One of my favorite parts of A Song of Ice and Fire lore is the Golden Company. I've come to love them quite a lot over the last year and a half. I've really become more of a Blackfire guy. Aegor, if you're watching this video, you know that. Got my Blackfire thing in the background. I wish they made more Blackfire merchandise, and I hope with Dunk and Egg coming along, I won't be this year. Probably when it comes out in season 2, we'll maybe start getting more Blackfire memorabilia and stuff like that, which would be awesome. But I really love, young Griff's plot line of introducing this new character that possibly could be Aegon Targaryen, Rhaegar's son, or is he, Illyrio's son, or the mysteries behind that. And going back to Griffin's Roost, with the character of Jon Connington is like very much like Theon, but maybe not as good as Theon, but still, there seeing his past ghosts and things like that. I really like Jon Conn in this book. I think that, once again, kind of how I feel about a lot of the characters that have 2 chapters or less. If they had been given more time, if characters like Tyrion and Quentyn had been more cut down in this book and we'd spent more time with some of these other POVs that are now kind of taking up the mantle, right, of being the best characters of the series, they just didn't get enough time in this book. And Jon Connington kind of gets a pass because we see a lot of him through Tyrion's earlier chapters. But, characters like, Arya or Bran, I think Bran specifically, and Cersei and Victarion, I wish we would have gotten more of them instead of getting more of Tyrion and Quentyn. Moving into our top 5. Now, this one might be, I guess, divisive. I don't know. Because to me, I think the North plotline is the best plotline of the book, whether that be with Davos, Theon, or Jon, or Asha. 4 of my top 5 all revolve around the North. I think if the Essos plot had not been as prevalent as it is in this book, especially with, Daenerys, Tyrion, Quentyn, all these characters, we have a substantial amount of plot in Essos. I think that this book would have been better. This book didn't have as much of it. But with that said, number 5, I have Asha. Now, Asha has 3 chapters, and I think all of them are fantastic, right? We have the Deepwood Motte attack at night, Stannis capturing Asha, which is one of my favorite chapters of the book. I know people don't like it because of the Carl the Maid section. It's basically a big sex scene in the middle of the book. I don't mind it as much as I usually don't like when George really goes deep into basically writing sex novels. But I actually don't mind it here because it serves a very important narrative focus in that Asha feels completely surrounded. She feels like there's no way out. She feels like doom is coming or she's going to have to go into exile. And, these few moments with Carl the Maid, they kind of alleviate that, right? For a few moments, Asha forgets about those stresses and she's just, a woman again or whatnot. And so I get the pushback on Asha. I do. I personally love Asha. Asha is one of my favorite characters. Of the female characters, she's definitely up there as being one of my favorites. And, I love that then we get to see her paired with a character like Stannis, right? Being the POV into him, being such a different character, right? Of looking at Stannis. So we've seen Stannis through characters like Catelyn, like Davos, like Jon. It's very different with Asha because Asha comes from a family that is in direct, conflict with someone like Stannis. Stannis is the reason, in a lot of ways, the Greyjoy Rebellion did not, go anywhere. He was the one that thwarted their navy. And so you have this interesting back and forth between, Asha seeing, this almost like Napoleon in Russia type campaign with Stannis trying to get to Winterfell and how horribly that goes. And then even her last chapter where there's so much tension built up and seeing, Theon and her reunite once again. If, we had gotten something where Tyrion and Quentyn had been cut down and Asha had been given more chapters to finish out the real northern plotline with Stannis taking on this Frey force, she'd be probably up there right underneath Theon. But because she only has 3 chapters, she doesn't finish in the best spot, right? Her finish in the book is basically she meets Theon after he's been more or less rescued by Mor's Crowfood Umber and then been taken back to the camp with this party that Jon sent to them with the Iron banker. And so she doesn't end on the craziest note. She doesn't end where you would naturally think that plot line was going. And so because of those reasons, I think that kind of holds Asha down. Number 4, I have as Barristan. Now, Barristan has 4 chapters, but it's kind of weird because all of Barristan's chapters come at the very end of the book. All 4 of his come in the last quarter of the book, but he's such an interesting POV. If you like Ned, for instance, if Ned's one of your favorite POVs, you will love Barristan because it feels the exact same. And that feeling that I got when I was doing my reread of Game of Thrones and I was coming on here every week and breaking down the book, and especially Ned because he's so prevalent in that book, all of those feelings come back when you read Barristan because it's the same idea, but just in Essos. You take Barristan, who's a very honorable man, who's been through a lot of things in his life. He has a lot of knowledge on things like Robert's Rebellion, the War of the Nine Penny Kings, the Defiance of Duskendale, Aerys's reign. He has just so much knowledge that's fascinating. He also has some of this, old man kind of wisdom and how he views things like love and Ashara before the Robert's Rebellion stuff. He's just such a fascinating POV that I love to hear from. Like, he's one of those like grandpas that has really good stories that you just kind of want to like hear more about. That's Barristan. He's a character that can provide so much lore to things we just do not know in the story right now. Like the War of the Nine Penny Kings is something that we don't know all that much about. We know like the general outline, but we don't have specific stuff that Barristan would be able to tell us. And so you have that part of it. You then have the part of it where you put Barristan in a very uncomfortable situation. Daenerys is gone, and he's being pushed into acting because of his Dar and how he's managed Meereen. And, he's having to try and play politics, something that Ned struggled with a lot. Barristan's the exact same, and so their plot lines run very similar. Barristan has to do some sort of coup to get his Dar out of power, to put himself more or less in power, and then going to fight the slavers and all of that. I think the only knock and the reason that I decided to put Davos ahead of Barristan as the last 4-chapter POV is Barristan doesn't really end on a natural spot either. He's very similar to Asha in that regard, is that you would think, right, the ending point for Barristan would be the Battle of Fire, because we're building up to this conflict between the slavers and Meereen, and we're not going to see that till Winds of Winter. It would almost feel like if in A Clash of Kings, we were building up to the Battle of the Blackwater. We get, Tyrion and Davos having one chapter before the battle starts, and then just not showing it until the beginning of the Storm of Swords. It's what it feels like, right? We've been building up to this conflict the whole book, and then it's not going to happen. So those things really, I think, hold back POVs like Barristan and Asha from going further. Whereas for my number 3, Davos, who also has 4 POV chapters, he ends on a more normal note, right? His whole goal is to try and get Wyman Manderly to back Stannis, right? Okay, well, we get to about the middle point of the book. There's this whole North Remembers plot that comes out, and so Davos has to have this mission in Skagos, and we don't see him the rest of the book. It would have been great to see him, the rest of the book, to go to Skagos, but it's a natural endpoint that makes sense to then focus on other things going on in the story. So Davos, to me, is a more complete story, even though he's only in about half of it, than, say, someone like Barristan. Now, Davos has always been a favorite of mine. He's a POV into the Stannis camp. I love this character. Davos is up there as one of my favorites. And I just love what we get from his POV. I think everybody always looks at the stuff in White Harbor, which is fantastic, of course. Don't get me wrong. But I do like his opening chapter as well. And how that, him basically being at the sisters kind of, again, foreshadows Ned when he was there during Robert's Rebellion. I love that tie-in. I love the way that connects, this area on the north, building out the world a bit, but also making Davos go into more of this mode of being the smuggler and going back into what he used to be. And that kind of carries on. I will say Davos 2 is his weakest of the book because it's a chapter where he arrives at White Harbor, but not a whole lot happens. It's really Davos gauging, what the public feel about what Wyman Manderly's doing and the state of the castle and all that stuff. It's more of a, setup chapter for Davos 3. And then Davos 3, his whole meeting with Wyman Manderly, it's so great because you feel like Davos, right? Because you have the phrase trying to say all this stuff about what really happened at the Red Wedding and all that stuff. And, you as a reader, what happened, right? And so you're there with Davos saying, no, Wyman Manderly, why are you going with these phrases? They went against you. They went against your king. They hold your son hostage. Why would you back them? And so then when you get to Davos 4, and you do think that Davos might die, given the fact that in Feast for Crows, in a small council meeting with Cersei, we do hear that Davos dies. And so we're sitting here going, okay, wait, Davos is now in prison. Is he going to die? And then you get, in my opinion, the best chapter of the book, which is the North Remembers. The whole plot coming out with Wyman Manderly and Davos. It's just so fantastically done, tying back to the Red Wedding and the whole North plot as a whole, adding to the conflicts that are going on with Roose trying to rally the North against Stannis. It's paced beautifully. The beginning of the chapter, Davos basically writing to, his wife and his kids because he thinks he's going to die. It's just a perfect chapter in my opinion. And so Davos has the best chapter of this book, which is why he has to be pretty close to the top in my opinion. I just wish we'd gotten maybe a little bit more of him, but he's one of those characters that usually doesn't get a big focus on. And so of the side characters, the characters with like 4 POV chapters or less, in my opinion, he is the best one. Number 2 is Jon Snow. Finally, Jon Snow is kind of the dominant POV of a book. And that's just the case here. He has the most of the book. He is the more entertaining of the main 3. Again, I have Daenerys at 10 and Tyrion at 17. So of the characters that have more than 10 chapters or at 10 chapters, he is by far the best. I think the North plot line is fantastic. And there's really 2 phases of Jon, right? The first phase is Jon struggling to figure out how to be the Lord Commander, figuring out what kind of Lord Commander he's going to be, and then managing both the Night's Watch and Stannis. Stannis is the kind of that first half arc for Jon. And there's just some standout chapters in those early points, right? When you have things like Mance's alleged death, seeing how that impacts a character like Jon, having Janos Slynt and his execution, something that we've been waiting to see for books now, seeing Stannis and Jon depart, and even Stannis and Jon negotiating about certain things. And then you see him then shift in the second half, which is all about the wildlings, trying to get the wildlings south of the wall, just so they're not added to the army of the dead, and seeing how Jon navigates that and the bad decisions he makes, his poor communication. I think that Jon is really good in this book. I would put this up there as his best book with A Storm of Swords. I think they're pretty equal. I lean towards A Storm of Swords. I like more some of the things that George explores more with the character in that book than this one, but still fantastic in this book. Every Jon chapter has something to offer. There is no bad Jon Snow chapter, in my opinion. I think there's some okay ones that don't really stand out all that much, and that's going to happen when you have 13 POV chapters. But the more likely than not, he has some pretty solid and good ones throughout the book that keep you pretty entertained. There's some great moments with like Alice Karstark and Jon and their kind of relationship, Val and Jon, Tormund and Jon, Mel and Jon, how that all works out. And then he has, in my opinion, outside of maybe Theon, has one of the best conclusions to the story, right? His death, all these events, how he's leading has led to this moment where people have turned against him and he dies at the end of the book. It's the big cliffhanger of this book. You look back at Game of Thrones, the cultural impact of Jon's death had at the end of season 5 and that time between season 5 and 6. That same thing happens in the books, except it's just way better done. So yeah, Jon Snow at 2 for me, just because I think number 1, Theon. Theon, to me, of the last 2 books, is the clear best POV. He is just, the way George wrote this character, it's just fantastic. This is his, I would say, some of his best writing of the entire series is Theon. Theon going from, the beginning of the book, where we didn't know he was even still alive. This isn't the show. We didn't have scenes in between Clash of Kings and A Dance with Dragons. We didn't know where Theon was. We didn't know how he was doing. And when you come back and he's this character who's missing fingers and, toes, and he's, old looking and super thin, and he's completely broken as a character of this Reek character. And George goes and takes this character on a journey of exploring his past, slowly breaking out of this Reek situation, and that slow burn that you're waiting for Theon to come back, or at least some part of Theon to break through. It's just really, really well done. And we see so much darkness through this character, of the characters like Ramsay, Roose, Barbary, Dustin. The list goes on in terms of the North. And he is our counter Asha POV, right? Because we're seeing, Roose and Ramsay through his eyes. And so some of his chapters, and the best ones for me, are at Winterfell. I think as Theon goes, he is the most, natural character of the book. He starts out, I would say, at his weakest in terms of as a character, but also how good his chapters are. And all of his chapters are good, by the way. When I'm saying his weakest, I mean like maybe his first chapter is like top 30, but by the end, every single chapter he has is like a top 15 chapter. He only gets better as the book goes until you finally get to this point where You know, this Jane Poole character has been married to Ramsay, and that's the thing kind of pulling him out of being Reek until he's forced to help her escape, and he becomes, you know, Theon, or at least a better version of Theon, once again helping to save Jane Poole. And that character arc, where you have such a compelling character arc, but not only that, you have a very interesting plot that forwards the plot in every single chapter, right? Whether that's the taking of Moat Cailin, whether that's going to Winterfell and seeing this fake Arya married to Ramsay, that is an extremely important plot point in this book. Whether it's Theon kind of exploring all these mysteries and murders that are happening in the castle, or going to the crypts with Barbary Dustin. So what I'm trying to say with Theon is, I think that, you know, this book, Dance of Dragons and Feast for Crows, really struggled with how do you expand the world while also giving a very compelling character arc where you're also forwarding the plot. And sometimes George struggles with that. And I think he struggled a lot of that with a character like Tyrion in this book. But Theon is the perfect character in this book. Theon, I would say, for a good portion of this book, until A Dance with Dragons gets going, which is like that last quarter of the book, Theon carries this book. At the beginning of it, I think at the beginning, until you get to kind of like the middle area, Theon carries the book. From the moment he starts as a character, when you see that Reek, he is, in my opinion, the best character of the book. So that is my ranking of the POVs in A Dance with Dragons. Let me know what you guys think. Do you guys agree with me? Do you guys think maybe a character should be higher? Let me know. I'd love to hear your guys' ratings, and I'll see you guys all in the next one. Bye, guys.